Good morning. Good morning. My name is Reverend Nanette Pitt. I have the pleasure and the honor of being the pastor here at First Congregational Church of Akron. Thank you so much for coming out today, for spending this time with us. As you know, this is our 190th anniversary year, and last week, Friday last, so not yesterday, but a week ago, was the anniversary of our being chartered on November the 3rd, 1833. And last Sunday, Representative Emilia Sykes had one of her staff members drop off a certificate of special congressional recognition. We didn't ask for it, and it was a wonderful surprise, and I'd like to share it with you today, just as we celebrate as members of the congregation and realize what a special occasion this is. Presented to First Congregational Church of Akron in honor of 190 years of service and fellowship. For almost 2 centuries, members of First Congregational Church of Akron have been dedicated to serving our community and spreading the Lord's message through good deeds. Members have and continue to open their arms to the tired, poor, and hungry through various programs. The congregation's dedication to its core values of acceptance, spirituality, and community is commendable, and it welcomes all with open arms to worship. Your service to the Lord, this community, and one another is admirable. Thus, I do hereby extend First Congregational Church of Akron this expression of my sincere congratulations on its 190th anniversary. I wish the church many more years of growth and service to the Lord and the community. Signed, Emilia Sykes, Member of Congress, 13th District of Ohio. Thank you. And it now gives me great pleasure to introduce one of our leaders here at First Church, former moderator Sarah Vredenberg, who will introduce our speaker.
Save it for the important guy. Good morning. My name is Sarah Vredenberg, and I have the unenviable task of introducing somebody who needs no introduction. I won't let that stop me. David, a lifelong resident of Akron, has donned about every hat a civic-minded person can wear. Journalist, lawyer, deputy mayor, entrepreneur. He sat on or chaired the boards of many significant organizations. A self-proclaimed history nerd, he has guided the celebrations of nearly every community milestone Akron has observed over the last 30 years. In 2019, he was given the Bert M. Polsky Award, Humanitarian Award for Community Service. He is the force behind the Akron History Center, a museum of all things Akron to open in 2024. Currently, he is Executive Secretary of the Bicentennial Commission that will, in 2 years, help us all celebrate a city that continues to show the world what inventiveness and hard work can create. First Church and Akron have grown up together. Only 8 years after Akron was founded, a group of people decided to put down spiritual roots in this canal town, chartering First Congregational Church on November 1833. Akron was fertile ground for this fledgling church. From the first, this church's members involved themselves in the issues of the day. In the lead up to the Civil War, many members' homes were stationed on the Underground Railroad. Even after the war, this experience so moved member Laura Spellman that she urged her husband, John D. Rockefeller, to donate the seed money that transformed the Atlanta Baptist Female Seminary into Spellman College, the first college in the nation devoted solely to educating young Black women. Akron's growing population needed schools. At first, schools were established and funded by private individuals and organizations ensuring that the children of the well-off and elite received the schooling they needed, while those of lower classes received inferior educations, if any at all. First Church minister Isaac Jennings saw the need, developed and advocated a system of graded public schools funded by property taxes, not personal wealth. This model has continued as the basis for public education throughout the country for more than 170 years. In 1909, First Church invited Tuskegee Institute founder Booker T. Washington to give talks at this church and one at Wesley Temple. Unfortunately, the owner of the Booktel Hotel would not give him his already booked room. Instead, our pastor, Howard McAyel, found alternative accommodations at the Empire House, whose owner was a Civil War veteran. At first, census and other historical documents did not include the names of women leading charity and reform organizations. However, because they most often were offshoots of Protestant church activities, the listed religious affiliations of these anonymous women showed that First Church members often constituted a majority of the members of these organizations. They were present at the beginning of most of the significant charitable and service organizations in Akron, none more important than the Young Women's Christian Association. The YWCA was formally organized in 1901 at First Church. It focused on the needs of young women finding jobs at the rubber factories for safe housing, education, and recreation. The burgeoning rubber companies were drawing thousands of people to Akron, many from West Virginia and the South. Akron was no stranger to racial bias, but these new residents brought Jim Crow with them. In the mid-1920s, the KKK held a majority of seats on the Akron School Board. The Reverend Lloyd C. Douglas challenged them and opened our church to baccalaureate services for Black graduating seniors when no other church would open. Douglas would go on to write many novels, among them Magnificent Obsession, The Robe, and both of which became popular Hollywood productions. Our mission remains the pursuit of social justice. We are a meaningful part of the annual Martin Luther King Jr. Day commemoration. We support and celebrate this building of the Sojourner Truth Monument. We openly welcome the LGBTQ community, and we are steadfast in growing our food ministry, which has fed more than 1 million people since 1982. And one of our members, the late Dick Hansford, suggested the University of Akron adopt a kangaroo as its mascot. Hello, Zippy. Today, let's celebrate the long shared history of Akron and First Congregational Church, a symbiotic relationship of creativity, heart, and civic service. Let's welcome Mr. Akron, David Lieberth.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Nanette, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're celebrating your 190th anniversary because so few things we are associated with have this kind of longevity. I read the autobiography of William O. Douglas, the late Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. His father was an itinerant minister in Minnesota. Traveling from town to town, he would try to gin up a congregation, and one night in Bickleton, Minnesota, far north part of the town, about 25 miles from nowhere, the Reverend Douglas stepped into the sanctuary, and there was one person sitting in the congregation. Word of my arrival has apparently not spread, Reverend Douglas said. I guess we'll just wait and see. He sat down and he played a hymn on the old organ, and with the winds howling outside, he thought maybe that was going to be his total congregation. He said, maybe we should just call it a night. Well, the man stood and said, well, Reverend Douglas, I'm just a cowboy, but if I went out on a night like this to feed my herd, and I could find but one animal, I would not let that one cow starve. Reverend Douglas was taken by the man's simple eloquence. So he roared back and he let loose with his best hellfire, brimstone, and salvation speech. 45 minutes later, he was breathing heavy. How'd I do? He asked the cowboy. He said, well, Reverend Douglas, I'm just a cowboy, and if I went out on a night like this to feed my herd and I could find but one animal, I don't think I'd dump the whole load on that one cow. 200 years is a lot of history, but I've brought about a half a load with me today. I'm inspired by our history. It's been my avocation for 50 years. And the best explanation I've heard yet why we study history comes from John Meacham. His book, Soul of America, describes a lot about our present condition. The tyranny of the present, he says, is this mistaken idea that the crises of our time, and we have a lot of them, are unprecedented, and that we have to solve them without experience to guide us. By studying our past, Meacham says, knowing how those who came before us found the ways and means to surmount the difficulties of their age, we stand a far better chance of acting in the moment with perspective and measured judgment. So it's best to start at the beginning, as we always do, when the last glacier retreated from what is now northeast Ohio. It left behind, carved into our landscape, the hills, valleys, ravines, debris that gave us the moraines of sand and gravel and clay on which Akron was built. But to really understand Akron history, you need to appreciate that for most of our recorded history, about 220 years, topography dictated what happened here, what grew here, what failed here, and how it even continues to reshape and redefine our city today. Akron's founder, General Simon Perkins, came here as a 23-year-old surveyor, and he purchased for himself the high land at the point where he thought the Ohio and Erie canals being planned at that time would cross the watershed divide. He knew that it had to cross this great watershed divide, one of the few in the United States. Now, if you're sitting at the corner of Main and Exchange in downtown Akron, you're 1,067 feet above sea level. It's one of the highest points in Ohio. And of course, this fact was known to the original people who occupied this land. This past October 2nd, we celebrated our 7th annual First Peoples Day in Akron, and I'd like to acknowledge the indigenous population that occupied this land for millennia. The names they used to identify themselves are largely unknown to us. Native Americans who were stewards of this place before the first Europeans arrived included the Haudenosaunee. You may know them as the Seneca and the Cayuga from the Iroquoian Confederacy, the Huron, the Shawnee, the Ojibwe, and the Lenni Lenape, who you may know as the Delaware. These Indian nations were forcibly removed from the land that they sustained for hundreds of years. We still can recognize they existed here because the portage path is one of the oldest scars on the North American landscape, and it runs right through Akron. An 8-mile trail from the Big Bend in the Cuyahoga River that crosses the watershed divide to the Tuscarawas River. In 1785, the portage, along with the Cuyahoga and the Tuscarawas rivers, formed a boundary designating land legally open to European settlement. Territory west of the portage and the two rivers was reserved to the American Indian nations who lived here. They used the portage to travel between the two rivers, flowing north and flowing south. There's a spot just south of the city, down near Summit Lake, where if you threw sticks into the water, they would divide. Some of those sticks would flow into the Tuscarawas River, the Muskingum River, the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, and end up in the Gulf of Mexico. And some of those sticks would flow north. They would flow into the Little Cuyahoga River, the Cuyahoga River, Lake Erie, the St. Lawrence River, and end up in the Atlantic Ocean. Simon Perkins, and Akron's first real resident, Paul Williams, were aware that if this land that they owned would surge in value if the canal was constructed over this divide. And eventually, of course, 16 locks that lifted boats a total of 149 feet were in this 1-mile staircase of locks. If you look at that bottom illustration, you can see the laser pointer's not going to work. You can see where Lock 1 is there at the top. That's Exchange Street. And if you look all the way down to Lock 16, that's in the Merriman Valley. These 16 locks would lift boats a total of 149 feet in that 1-mile staircase of locks. There were naturally occurring kettles, glacial kettles, in the portage lakes, and they became the reservoirs that would meet the needs of the hydraulics for this system of locks. It took about 100,000 gallons of water to move one boat through. In 1827, the first canal boat left Akron to go down to Cleveland. And therein lies a problem that I hear all the time. People from Cleveland like to say, I'm going down to Akron. I never fail to remind them that they're going up to Akron, as a matter of fact. With the canal connecting Lake Erie to the Ohio River, Akron then could become an agricultural center. The son of Akron's founder, Colonel Simon Perkins, held one of the largest and best regarded flocks of sheep that produced fine merino wool. It was one of the finest in the United States. Colonel Simon Perkins, like other men of his day, invested heavily in multiple manufacturing industries. He and others were really part of a 19th century explosion of creativity in Akron. We had here a whole series of serial entrepreneurs. It was not unusual for men running one business to have significant interests in another. O.C. Barber, the match king, his diamond matches were the most popular, and he made more matches in Akron during the gaslight era than any place on earth. Barber said a businessman should take an active interest in at least 5 businesses at one time, just to keep his mind sharp and active. One of our first industries here, of course, was clay products. There were natural deposits of clay east of the city, right down here at the foot of East Market Street at Case Avenue. They provided the raw materials that boosted the manufacture of vessels like were produced by Merrill Pottery or Robinson Clay Products. An Akron invention, though, the vitrification of clay pipe, allowed Akron to become the sewer pipe capital of America, exactly at the time that cities were being created along the eastern seaboard. Think New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Providence, Rhode Island. All of those cities had sewage flowing in the streets. Now this was the time at the end of the 19th century to put the sewage underground. Not very glamorous, but really important. And Akron's invention of vitrification that made the pipe impervious to water allowed all of those systems to develop. I can also think I can make the case that we are the home of the American toy industry. It began with the American Marble and Toy Manufacturing Company, clay marbles, soon became ceramic spheres, later glass. We made 1 million marbles a day that left Akron in 1899. And of course, later we had Sun Rubber and Rempel Products, Anderson Rubber, and Sawfield Children's Books. Now, in addition to these serial entrepreneurs, we also had serial entrepreneurs. Akron became the home of the American cereal industry. It was Ferdinand Schumacher who, during the American Civil War, took a German recipe that he had brought with him that turned oats into a breakfast cereal. Prior to that time in America, oats were largely food for horses. He eventually would create the Quaker Oats Company. This building sat right where Cascade Plaza is today, and it was where Quaker puffed wheat and Quaker puffed rice, the cereal shot from guns, was produced for the entire country. And because we were an agricultural center, we were also the home to the manufacture of farm implements, mowers and reapers, plows and threshers. The Buckeye Mower and Reaper Company was established in 1864, right at the end of the Civil War. It was located exactly where E.J. Thomas Performing Arts Hall is today. And by 1891, they were producing 26,000 mowers, reapers, rakes, and harvesters every year. The superintendent of the factory was Lewis Miller, a name you know. He patented the Buckeye Mower and Reaper. But in 1874, he is also known for having founded the Chautauqua Assembly. And next year will be Chautauqua Institution's sesquicentennial. Lewis Miller lived with his wife and 11 children at Oak Place. It's a house that still sits over downtown Akron. I'm happy to report that it's been acquired by a new owner who is doing some wonderful restorations inside the house. It's really great. And of course, his daughter, Mina Miller, married a very famous man, Thomas Edison, in February 1886 in Oak Place's parlor. The Akron Daily Beacon called the event the most notable nuptials in Akron history. Well, that description would remain unchallenged until 1947, when down the street, Martha Firestone married William Clay Ford at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. And the congregation of First Church, as Clara noted, appreciated Lewis Miller's other great invention, the development of the Akron Plan for the design of churches. First Congregational has the distinction of having one of the last remaining examples of the Akron Plan Sunday school space. And in 2004, when the church's preservation of the Akron Plan resulted in its being listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Today, there's only 3 original examples in Akron in the city of its birth. And while other churches, sort of gutted their Akron Plan layout or simply demolished it, First Congregation did not. General Perkins also began another tradition, one of philanthropy. He insisted that owners deed land for the community, not just for the canal itself, which he and Paul Williams did, but also churches, public buildings, and parks. Now, his son, Simon Jr., gave the city Union Park, which is a 9-iron shot out your back door, and Grace Parks, which is a good 9-iron shot out your front door, both nearby. And Colonel Perkins himself was the president on a volunteer basis of Glendale Cemetery for 41 years. His grandson was George Todd Perkins, the 3rd president of B.F. Goodrich Company. And in 1890, some reform-minded women approached him. They wanted to launch the day nursery movement in Akron to provide places where working women could find safe care for their children. So Colonel Perkins donated a house in honor of his daughter and granddaughter. They were both named Mary. And so the Mary Day Nursery became in existence, and it then later provided medical care as well. In 1912, Akron, Ohio, had more pediatric beds than did Cleveland, Ohio. And then Children's Hospital separated from the day nursery in 1960 and moved to its present location at Perkins Square. When Akron itself was a mere 8 years old, as a town with about 400 residents, the city's first formally organized church congregation was chartered, the first church within the city limits, and that's First Congregational that began on November 3rd, 1833. Its first building was on South High Street. The location is where the Summit County Courthouse would be built and then rebuilt again. But First Congregational, as Sarah noted, has been embedded in Akron's history for almost as long as Akron has existed. Over this period, Akron was finding success as a center of commerce, and there were a few fledgling industries that led the way. And I'm sure most people who've lived here for any length of time know something of our industrial history. What is often forgotten are those important social movements that either started here or were nurtured here in remarkable ways for a city our size. And the first movement was publicly funded education. In 1846, Reverend Isaac Jennings, a Yale-educated pastor, joined a few others who felt responsible for a very new progressive movement, paying to educate other people's children. How remarkable. He chaired a committee that would create a new system. Schools would have their own separate governance with the school board. They would create their own money by allowing residents to vote to raise taxes. The board would receive monies, do the schools, hire teachers, contract for buildings, develop curriculum. Does this sound familiar? It was this plan that became the Akron School Laws, adopted by the legislature in 1847. And after that was adopted by the State Assembly, every city in Ohio adopted the Akron Plan for Education, still in place today, and most of the cities that were moving westward at that time adopted it as well. Within a decade, most developing cities on the U.S. frontier adopted the Akron Plan for Education. And in 1853, Akron, Ohio became the first city in the United States to offer a free high school education for all of its students. There was a second social movement nurtured in Akron during this same period. In 1851, as Ohio was revising its state constitution, many hoped the reformers would give women the right to vote. Women of Ohio met in the old stone church on North High Street in May of 1851. They called it the National Women's Rights Convention. And there was one speaker, Isabella von Swearingen, demolished the arguments put forward by opponents of women's suffrage with an impromptu speech that is still remembered today. Of course, you know her as Sojourner Truth. She stood and spoke at a time when not only women did not speak much in public, but certainly not former enslaved people. Her speech, Ain't I a Woman, years later is still recalled today. There's a new plaza adjacent to the United Way on High Street that is being built to honor her with a statue. The statue is being created by Akron sculptor Woodrow Nash. A third movement accompanied the draconian passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850. And Akron was today what we might call a sanctuary city, a place where enslaved African people could find support as they traveled north on the Underground Railroad. Now, it is my belief that John Brown is the single most consequential person ever to live in Akron or Summit County. He came to believe that violence was not only acceptable, but would be necessary to achieve the eradication of African slavery in America. His methods were very difficult: human butchery, bloodshed, death. They remain controversial, and they echo loudly in our own time. In 1844, Brown moved his family to the two-room cottage that is still at Copley Road and Diagonal Road. Colonel Perkins farmed about 150 acres around the stone mansion on Copley Road and South Portage Path. Brown would cross the Ohio River on his trips for the Perkins-Brown Partnership to West Virginia, then Virginia, and Pennsylvania, and he would be in the company of fugitive slaves. Brown then believed that a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, would inspire an uprising of slaves against their masters, and he felt that that would destabilize the institution of slavery. Between his capture and arrest at the hands of U.S. Army Colonel Robert E. Lee, and between that on October the 18th and his execution on December 2nd, John Brown was perhaps the most famous man in the Western world. And in fact, he did destabilize the South. His mission failed, but his words launched debates across the United States, and the Smithsonian Institution today calls the period of the American Civil War the point at which Harper's Ferry, with John Brown's assault, started, and with Abraham Lincoln's assassination ended. And no one less than Harriet Tubman herself said that John Brown did more to eradicate slavery than any other man, including Abraham Lincoln. Now, not all movements at the time gained traction. One that is memorable involved the third pastor of this church, James D. Pickens. Not long after assuming his duties, he fell under the influence of Second Adventism, promulgated by its founder, William Miller, who proclaimed that the end of the world was set for April 4th, 1843. Reverend Pickens and his followers, known as the Millerites, sold their possessions, paid their debts, suspended their businesses, and acquired white ascension robes for the flight to the hereafter. On April 4th, nothing happened. Father Miller said he'd made a mistake in his calculations. Judgment Day was going to be April 23rd, excuse me. Then he said, when nothing happened on April 23rd, that he'd been using Jewish time, but the Gentile time, Judgment Day, would be March 22nd, 1844. But Reverend Pickens' belief in Millerism split this church. The defectors began to call themselves the Second Congregational Church. In 1844, they built a church at North Main Street and Talmadge Avenue. And when the Millerite faction fell apart, the church resumed its former name, the one that you have today. Reverend Pickens, incidentally, gave up the ministry, and he later edited a newspaper devoted to wool growing. The one question that may have come to mind, often new people to our community ask this question: how come Akron became the rubber capital of the world? I mean, we don't see any rubber trees out there, do we? In 1950, more than half of all the tires produced in the world were actually manufactured here. And there's no earthly reason why the rubber industry should have settled here. Now, we did have land, and we had water, we had canals, we had trains. Importantly, we had established tool and die makers. But mostly what we had that other cities did not was capital. A few years ago, I was working on a new history of the Gilded Age in the Akron Summit County Public Library Special Collections Division, and I discovered how Dr. Benjamin Franklin Goodrich got to Akron in the first place. He was 19 when he graduated from the Cleveland Medical College. He was an Army surgeon in the Civil War. And one day in 1870, he was walking down the street in his hometown, Jamestown, New York, and he ran into an old friend, Clement Barnes. Now, there's a name that's been lost to rubber history. Clement had recently married a woman from Akron, and he'd opened a men's haberdashery on Howard Street. When he learned that the doctor had been dabbling in real estate, Barnes talked up the town, wanted him to come to Akron, where we had successful industries in 1870, clay products and farm machinery and many, many others. Now, Dr. Goodrich may or may not have seen a circular that was published by the Board of Trades boasting of the city's successes. But that summer, he did meet George Todd Perkins. He was president at that time, in 1870, of the Bank of Akron, located in what is now what we call the Everett Building on South Main at Market. On behalf of the Booster Committee of the Board of Trade and as bank president, he led the negotiations with Dr. Goodrich and went to Melrose, New York to see for himself what he had. Now, neither Jamestown nor Cleveland had much interest in courting him, but the business leaders of Akron, 22 of them, some of these names will be familiar to you, came up with $13,600. That's about $300,000 in today's money. And then Goodrich moved lock, stock, and fire hose to an old building on the Ohio and Erie Canal. It took time to make a profit and to pay off his loans, but by 1890, he was at the top of the bicycle tire business during America's cycling craze. In 1898, Frank Seiberling saw Goodrich's success and started his own company, named for a man who never set foot in Akron, the inventor of vulcanization, Charles Goodyear, at a building that his family had had an interest in on East Market Street. And 2 years later, a salesman who peddled rubber tires for carriages started to form his own company, and the eponymous Firestone Tire and Rubber Company was born. By 1915, William O'Neill started General Tire, and those are the big four. By the end of the Second World War, more than 70,000 people were employed in the Akron area's rubber companies. Now, here's the lightning round coming at you. So that is why the headquarters of 5 of the 6 largest tire companies in the United States were located in Akron. It's why Akron had 3 Fortune 500 firms when the magazine started its list in 1955, while Cleveland and Cincinnati each had 1 and Columbus had none. It's why Akron was the fastest growing city in the country in 1920, and why in 1920 Akron was home to 100 millionaires. It's why the first class on rubber chemistry, the first in the world, was taught by Dr. Charles Knight at Buchtel College in 1909. It's why Akron created an entirely new transportation industry, and in the 1950s, we were headquarters for 27 separate long-distance trucking firms. It's why Akron was where the first practical golf ball was invented and manufactured, where the first rubber-soled canvas athletic shoes were made for sports teams. It's where balloons were first made for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and it's where small factories in Akron during 2 world wars turned out millions of prophylactics distributed to GIs. It's where the U.S. Navy, with its established relationship with Goodyear Aircraft, positioned Akron to build the first nuclear warhead-equipped guided missile to be fired from a submarine. And to build those missiles, it's where Goodyear Aircraft built the very first high-speed analog computer, think Google, that was used by the FAA for air traffic control in the 1950s. Today, Akron is beginning a new era in the history of tire manufacturing. Bridgestone's new factory on Wilbeth Road is building Firestone brand Firehawk racing tires. These are the tires that are used in every Indy Circuit race in the United States today. It's also where Goodyear builds every highly engineered racing tire on the NASCAR circuit made in Akron today. Goodyear's $170 million headquarters building, Bridgestone's $100 million technical center are other fruits of our tire-making legacy. The Bridgestone Technical Center is one of 3 in the world, the others being in Tokyo and Rome, and Goodyear's Technical Center is one of 2 in the world, the other being in Luxembourg. Today, there are 400 polymer-related companies located in the greater Akron area. They employ more than 30,000 people. Northeast Ohio is home to about 1,400 polymer companies of one sort or another, and within a 1 day's drive of Akron today, there are 2,500 companies that make, mold, extrude, store, manufacture polymer products of one kind or another. Another story that is often forgotten is how Akron played a major role in World War II. Now, everybody knows what happened on December 7th, 1941. But hardly anyone remembers what happened on December the 8th, when the Empire of Japan invaded the peninsula island of Malaysia. Because within 3 months, Japan cut off the world's supply, only supply at that time, of natural latex rubber. It only came from the South China Sea. Now, 12 days after Pearl Harbor, Goodyear, Goodrich, and Firestone went to Washington, and they gave the U.S. government their research on synthetic rubber. Akron chemists then had to compress 20 years of planning into a few months. The feat was unprecedented in history, and there are historians who say that the creation of synthetic rubber in Akron, it was being mass-produced by August of 1942, was more important to the Allied victories than the atomic bomb. That's an achievement worth remembering, and it's marked on a granite marker that sits in front of the Polymer Center at the University of Akron. Innovation has marked Akron for its entire history. Even today, we file more patent applications out of the Akron Metropolitan Statistical Area than any other metropolitan area of Ohio. In 1941, when battalions of men went to war, Akron women went to work. Goodyear's wartime workforce was 30,000 people, half were women. They made gas masks, barrage balloons, bullet-resistant gas tanks, life jackets, anti-aircraft gun mounts. These were the Rosies, whose red bandana was made famous in advertising, produced by the War Production Board. And at the end of the war, women were laid off in droves. The thousands upon thousands of people who made Akron the rubber capital between 1870 and 1970 are remembered today in the statue that was erected in 2020 in downtown Akron. And there is a plaque there, too, honoring the contributions of women to the rubber industry. The waves of immigrants from Appalachia that infused Akron with new people, a different culture, and an old-time religious fervor is also one way Akron is different from other Midwest industrial cities, like Cleveland or Youngstown or Chicago. The difference is who immigrated here. Unlike those other cities, we did not have a large immigration of Eastern Europeans. Instead, the rubber companies during World War I sent recruiters to the South. The coal had been tapped out, the oil wells dried up, farmland had soured. And so in West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi, people who were kind of kin to one another as to language, clothing, culture, and religion came to Akron because there was a job for every man who wanted a job. Brawn was needed. This was tough work making tires. In 1910, the population of Akron had about 3% of Appalachians, about 2,000. By 1920, 10 years later, there were 14,000 people here who boasted of Appalachian heritage. Now, I found it interesting that in 1930, almost 20,000 people attended the West Virginia Day Picnic in Akron. Want to guess who the guest speaker was that day? The governor of West Virginia. He couldn't find that many West Virginians in West Virginia. There's another sad chapter, though, to this, and one that First Church is involved in. In 1922, the mayor of Akron was asked by reporters what he was going to do about the advertised intention of the Ku Klux Klan to hold an open drive for membership in Akron. The mayor said, well, he's going to investigate it. He was going to investigate how they managed to rent the Akron Armory. And he may not have been entirely honest, since the mayor himself was later identified in court as a member of the Ku Klux Klan, along with the police chief, the sheriff, members of the school board, and city council. Akron, Ohio had one of the largest claverns of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1920s. Now, local Protestant ministers received personal invitations to attend that rally, and that sparked a denouncement of the Klan in print and in the pulpit by the pastor of First Congregational, Reverend Lloyd C. Douglas. In October of 1925, joined by the editor of the Beacon Journal, C.L. Knight, and an Akron lawyer, Wendell Wilkie, Reverend Douglas attacked the Klan at a public meeting. He said, "The city of Akron is sick. It is full of prejudice and hatred." Klan members interrupted him with catcalls, and they heckled him with jeers and yells and whistles and boos and shouts of, "Go back to Michigan." They nearly succeeded in breaking up the meeting. By 1926, thanks to Lloyd Douglas, Wendell Wilkie, C.L. and Jack Knight, the Ku Klux Klan was pretty much done in Akron. Prior to World War II, there were 4,000 African American men and women employed in the big companies in the rubber industry. They had the worst jobs in the factories. They were either janitors or charwomen largely, or they worked in the hellish heat of the pit, spending 10-hour days in the mill room where they would be drenched in soot and lampblack. Racism was evident at every level of the rubber companies. Cafeterias at Goodyear and Goodrich were segregated until the 1960s. The tire builders were called the royalty of the rubber shops. There were 2,000 of them in the 1950s. 12 of those coveted positions were held by black men. In the 19th and 20th centuries, early on, most people of color resided in the area bounded by North Broadway and Furnace Streets. It was the center of African American culture. The nation's jazz era was made famous by African Americans who produced jazz for audiences both black and white, but who were denied accommodations, as Sarah mentioned, in cities north and south. So pioneers such as Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald had to find another place to sleep. George Matthews came to Akron in the 1920s, and he operated a hotel on Howard Street, and the Hotel Matthews is a monument to the jazz era and Akron's own African American history. It was the life's work of Akron artist Miller Horns, who designed a sculptural monument on Howard Street, which you see today. It's a column of red brick, 15 feet tall, mounted on a concrete pad, and there are period lights and a barber pole evidencing that era. On June 7th, 1908, a new cornerstone was laid for a new building that would become home to First Congregational Church. The congregation marched from their old church on High Street to the new building. The first meeting of the new church was held in Sunday school rooms in March of 1910. This church's signature clock tower has been an Akron fixture since the building was completed. It's 5 stories tall, 100 feet high. The clock tower also has been struck by lightning several times in its history. Now, I can tell that many of you are of my generation, my age, and no doubt in college you also read novels by Kurt Vonnegut. In the year 2000, he wrote an essay, and he wrote this: "No one, not Shakespeare, not Beethoven, changed the course of so many lives all over the planet as 4 men from Ohio, 2 in Dayton and 2 in Akron." Of course, you know who the 2 from Dayton were: Wilbur and Orville Wright. The 2 from Akron: Robert Holbrook Smith and William Griffith Wilson. They were in Akron in 1935 when they made their invention, the 12 Steps to Sobriety of Alcoholics Anonymous. By comparison, Kurt Vonnegut said, to Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson, Sigmund Freud was a piker when it came to healing dysfunctional minds and lives. The story of how 2 men met in the Gate Lodge at Stan Hewitt, thrown together by a series of coincidences and chance, are really part of, call it, the luck Akron has had over 175 years. And although we celebrate Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson, all too often we neglect to honor Henrietta Seiberling, who not only brought the men together, but Henrietta was very spiritual in her beliefs and in her pursuits, and she is still regarded today as one of the people who was responsible for AA's bent towards spirituality. St. Thomas Hospital opened its doors to the community in 1928, and 11 years later, Sister Ignatia started an alcoholic ward to treat the patients of Dr. Bob. St. Thomas Hospital in Akron became the first hospital in the world to treat alcoholism as a medical condition. And I know that many of you are very much aware of the fact that every second weekend in June, thousands of pilgrims and visitors flock to Akron to pay their respects to Dr. Bob, to Bill Wilson, to Henrietta Seiberling, and Sister Ignatia, the founders of AA, as to what is really an internationally historic treasure. I've always looked at this story about AA, and come to this conclusion, what it means. What it really means to me is that it's how the largest small town in America works to our advantage, and how just one person, or maybe two, working together can quite literally change the entire world. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Yes. Dave was very gracious in our making a goodwill donation to the Summit Historical Society on his behalf, which we were very glad to do as a church community, supporting the efforts of our whole community and honoring his legacy as our history man here in Akron. And I know that you found that as informative as I did. Thank you so much, Dave. We couldn't let you go without a little something, though. So this is a whole lot of, well, no, it's not lunch. I'll pack that up for you
maybe
in
it was
a minute.
a sandwich, you know.
No, it's a whole lot of church memorabilia and tchotchke.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Please let's give Dave another round of applause. Thank you so much. We have a few minutes for questions if anybody has a question for Dave. I'll bring the microphone around.
Oh, Jim Carney has a question back there. Okay.
Oh, thanks, Jim.
Hi, David.
Hi.
We've touched on this before.
Yeah.
We have a great Sojourner Truth monument coming.
Yes.
How do you think we can open up the John Brown monument? Is that?
Yeah, we're doing it right now, as a matter of fact. It's a great question. Thank you for asking it, because as we plan for the bicentennial of Akron in 2025, there are 3 projects that are at the front burner. They are underway right now. One is the production of a new book on Akron history. We have 28 authors doing 28 chapters that will be published by the University of Akron Press in October of 2024, ahead of the bicentennial. The second forward-looking project is this one, the Akron History Center, which is at 172 South Main Street, 2 doors up from the Akron Civic Theater. We've now raised $1.7 million to support this project. There's 3 floors, 3,000 square feet of space for exhibits. The exhibits themselves are being produced right now. They're being fabricated in a workshop in Canal Fulton. They'll be installed probably in January, and our hope is that we can open this special museum about 200 years of Akron history in March or April of 2024. The third project may surprise some people, and it is the fact that when I called the Akron Public Schools to find out what kind of curriculum they had for the teaching of Akron for Akron history, they had none. There was no curriculum. for teaching Akron history to Akron public school students. And so Megan Mannion, one of the assistant superintendents, Adam Motter, who is the director of curriculum for social studies, have gathered a small group of teachers who we are going to pay in order to develop that curriculum on Akron history for 3rd and 4th graders, 7th and 8th graders, 11th and 10th and 11th graders. So all three will be kind of a different level, but those will be digital materials that will live online so that teachers today, if you haven't been in a classroom lately, it's pretty much all digital. They've got screens in every classroom. That's pretty much how that'll happen. We have 2 legacy projects. One might be near and dear to your hearts because it's close by, and that is that I would like to see the statue of Colonel Simon Perkins restored to Grace Park. It was taken down 20 years ago by Judge Bill Spicer, who placed it on his own with City Council's divided vote at a plaza on University Avenue next to what is now the Business College. When they expanded the Business College, about 2 years ago they started, 3 years ago maybe, the architect for the university called me and said, "What do you want to do with this statue?" I said, "Let's take him back to Grace Park." Well, it ended up that nobody had the money to do that, so they wrapped him in canvas and stored him on the railroad tracks down underneath. Today, the city has now moved Colonel Perkins to a safe place along with his black marble base to our Public Works warehouse. And I hope that one of our legacy projects can be to put that back. So now I get to your question. Because the other legacy project is, how do we gain access to the John Brown Monument? I went up there on John Brown's 200th birthday in 2000, and the place was a mess. There were all manner of debris, some of which you can pretty much guess. You know, beer bottles and cans, of course, cigarette butts, of course, and other stuff. And they were just scattered everywhere. There had been black graffiti painted on some of the walls of the Brown Monument, and it was a disgrace. Working with Mayor Plisquellic and the service director at the time, it appeared that we would clean it up, but then how would we protect it? Well, coincidentally, at exactly the same time, the Akron Zoo was doing a strategic plan about its long-term interests, including possibly moving the zoo out of that neighborhood altogether. Some of you will remember that Paul and Patricia Anthony were executed there in the woods in 1974. And so Mayor Plisquellic and the councilman, Marco Somerville, went to the zoo and said, "What if we gave you land to expand on?" And so they gave the zoo all the land off of Perkins Park Drive. The Metropolitan Housing Authority gave them land on the opposite side of Perkins Park Drive. The city agreed to vacate Perkins Park Drive, and in fact, that's where Grizzly Ridge is today, on that land. And they're going to develop the land in the future. Here was the problem. Once the zoo took ownership of the land, in order to keep their credentialing, they had to enclose all of their land with a fence. And so that fence went up. Good news, no more vandalism. Bad news, no more access for anybody. I've been leading tours up there about 3 times a year through the parking lot at the zoo. And the president of the zoo, Doug P. Akarsh, right now, has a plan on his desk. He's partnering with Lisa King, the head of Metro Parks, to develop a series of switchback trails that will go from the parking lot, ADA accessible trails, all the way up to the John Brown Monument. And so we're hoping that that actually can be done by 2025. It's certainly not visible at all. Mayor Plisquellic appointed a committee back in 1999. He asked me to chair it. And we looked at it very seriously, whether or not it should be moved. Divided opinions. Move it to a place where everybody can see it every day, or leave it where it is, where it was intended to be. Preservationists would say, leave it where it is, figure out another way to manage it. And so that's sort of what has happened just by default more than anything. The stars have never aligned to move it or to gain long-term access to it. The stars seem to be aligning now. Yeah. Yeah, there is wonderful art about the African migration of the 1920s and 30s. It did not affect us much. We had a very small black population for most of our history. It did grow during that period of time. But again, I mean, there was a job for every man and woman who wanted a job in Akron, but they were the worst jobs possible. Nevertheless, many black families were able to begin to accumulate wealth to buy homes, for example, which wasn't possible in the South, in many southern cities. But it was still, as Sarah mentioned, the folks from Appalachia brought with them Jim Crow preferences. They did not want their children going to school with black children in our public school system, for example. And there was something called the Akron Community Audit, done in 1950. It was sponsored by some churches. I didn't look to see if First Congregational was on that list. I bet you they are. And the labor unions at the time. And what they did is they did real research into what Akron looked like for African American families. And they documented the fact that hotels would not accept black guests when they accepted white guests. Theaters were segregated. Black residents were upstairs in the theaters. Skating rinks were segregated. Usually they might provide a night when there was skating for colored people. The swimming pools certainly were segregated. I don't know if you noticed, does the name Len, help me out, Jim, Len Chandler. Len Chandler mean anything to any of you? It didn't to me. Does to you? All of you, great. Oh, great. Well, Len Chandler, now, I was watching Willie Geist's Sunday morning program about 3 months ago, and on that segment where he says a life well lived, he had Len Chandler, a musician, a wonderful musician, blues, soul, jazz musician. And he had died at the age of 90 or something like that, and I thought, I know that name. So I went back into the notes that I keep on my computer, and sure enough, I had found a newspaper, a letter to the editor in 1953, I think, from Len Chandler, who had gone to Summit Beach Park to swim and was told by the owner of Summit Lake that they did not let colored people swim there. And he shouldn't count on it ever being so. Len Chandler wrote this very articulate letter to the editor about how difficult it was. And then Len left Akron, and he became famous as a musician, and he will be remembered specifically at the Akron History Center. One of the exhibits will be about him. Yeah.
There's another notable Akronite that is forgotten now, Henry E. Abbey. He was the manager of the Akron Academy of Music. His father owned a jewelry store on Main Street. After he was manager of the Music Academy, he became manager for many notable actors, including Henry Abbey, John Booth, Sarah Bernhardt. He took on tour a lot of that street. And then he moved to New York. He and his partner opened the Knickerbocker Theater, and then they established Metropolitan Opera House, which was the nouveau riche of the New York elite. The old money went to the Academy of Music. The new money went to the Metropolitan Opera back in those days. He was forgotten, and he's still forgotten. But my master's thesis at Akron U was about Henry Abbey.
Oh, I'll have to look it up because I recognize the name, and there are so many of those stories. You know, the problem isn't what we're going to put into the Akron History Center. The problem is what are we going to have to leave out, because our history is just so rich.